We are delighted to be hosting this important conversation today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Esra Özyürek. I'm the Sultan Qaboos Professor of Abrahamic Faiths and Shared Values here in the Faculty of Divinity. I am also the Academic Director of Cambridge Interfaith Program, which many will recognize as a long-standing place of engagement between the university and the wider public. As an anthropologist, I work to see the world as it is. Sometimes that reality can be unbeautiful. Lately, it has felt like our shared values have been eroded. For example, we see terrible conflicts and unprecedented inequality in human history, situations where international judgment says this is wrong, and yet it can feel like no one acts to stop it. Or where scientists tell us that our way of living is destroying the conditions that make for life on our planet, and yet the destructive behaviors do not end. So then I'm personally very interested, and indeed I think couldn't be more important to seek out ways of being and doing that do not hit those ugly limits. Today's event reflects the prior efforts and imagination of dozens of keen scholars, including one of my PhD students, Sai. And I would like to briefly acknowledge and thank some of those who made this event possible, including Dr. Mark Vernon, whom you might have seen at the front of the house, offering a welcome and the chance to buy copies of the book, Dr. Pui Him Ip from the Farah Institute, and Dr. Nick Spencer and colleagues at THEOS. It is good to collaborate with all of you. I will now hand over to an esteemed alumna of this faculty, Farah Jassat, a former journalist and now serving as the university's head of media, to chair the discussion.
Thank you, Esra. And thank you to the Cambridge Interfaith Programme and the Fetzer Institute for helping us to put on this event. So our discussion today will centre around exploring the sacred in human relations. And the question at the heart of this is as timeless as it is urgent. Can an understanding of the sacred help us to build a better future? Over the past 5 years, the Fetzer Institute has invited scholars who are rooted in their faith traditions to retell their sacred stories, remaining faithful to their origins and traditions and open and accessible to others. And the result is this book, Retelling Sacred Stories. It brings together 10 chapters, each drawing on the richness of a particular religious or spiritual tradition, and uses the power of storytelling to express that tradition's deepest values. We'll be exploring some of the questions at the core of the book today, such as, can cultivating a sense of the sacred change how we relate to one another? How can storytelling help us to rediscover a shared sense of the sacred? And would this help us to connect across differences to build a better future together? To discuss this, I'm joined by our illustrious panel. Dr. Ankur Barua is a senior lecturer in Hindu studies at Cambridge University. He researches the conceptual constellations and the social structures of Hindu traditions. Rabbi Dr. Lindsey Taylor-Guthartz is a scholar of contemporary Jewish life, specialising in the religious practices of the British Jewish community. She has a PhD from UCL and is the author of Challenge and Conformity, The Religious Lives of Orthodox Jewish Women. Dr. Giles Waller is a senior and teaching associate in Christian theology at Cambridge University. His work explores the intersections of Christian doctrine, philosophy, and literary tragedy. Dr. Bill Vendley is the former Secretary General of Religions for Peace, the world's largest multi-religious peace-building coalition. For decades, he coordinated interreligious councils across more than 90 countries, pioneering multi-faith cooperation in conflict zones, including Iraq, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Liberia. On leaving that role, he was commissioned to take forward the project of retelling sacred stories at the Fetzer Institute. And Riya Kartha is a writer, poet, and educator. She's currently completing a PhD in education at the University of Cambridge, where her research explores how commitment to Mahayana Buddhist spirituality impacts teachers' inner lives. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. So let's start by unpacking, what do we mean by the sacred? Some of us might use the term sacred as inherently linked to our faith or our religion. Others might find it in secular spaces. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to endeavour in 1 minute or less to explain what the sacred means to them. Ankur, can I start with you on that end and we'll come down?
Okay, thank you for the question. Since I have exactly 60 seconds, let me say that in my life as a human being and in my life as a scholar, because these two lives may not always be congruent, the question, what is the sacred, is one question that I've often grappled with and thought about quite a lot. So there is a thought, by the sacred, I mean a symbol of wholeness. I'm talking about the absence of fragmentation, whether inner or outer. And I do not simply mean it as a negative concept. I'm not just talking about the lack of violence. So right now, thankfully, nobody's fighting with one another in a physical struggle. But I also mean it in the sense of the fullness of a presence. So we may not have some kind of deep relationality. So when if we are able to get to such a state where we do not only not have physical violence in the world out there, but we also have systems of deep reciprocity, that would be what I mean by the symbol of the sacred. And as you can see, the symbol of the sacred for me has a temporal, almost a narrative structure. And I'm very deeply intrigued by how questions of time are so fundamental to our existence, how with little children we'll tell them stories starting with once upon a time and not once upon a place or somewhere in the world. So how the symbol of the sacred right now is something that we are trying to implement maybe in our everyday lives right now, but we know that our human efforts are often imperfect. So there is a hope that somewhere, somehow, sometime, we don't know how maybe, our finite human fragile attempt will be perfected. So that's my one-line formula, a symbol of wholeness with a narrative structure.
Thank you very much. Lindsay, can I come to you, please?
Right, I think I struggle with the concept of sacred to pin it down. It's not a word I use a great deal myself in my life. Judaism has a wonderful image of God being the place of the world, but the world is not his place. So I think for me, accessing the sacred could happen at all sorts of strange times and places. It could be in nature, it could be via my personal religious traditions, texts, very powerful for me. But to define it, I find extremely, extremely hard. We do have the concept of an ultimate God who is characterized by kedusha, by holiness. We have concepts of both holiness and profaneness is the wrong word. There's a Hebrew word of hol for the opposite of kodesh, of holiness, and they interact. They're not positive and negative. They're coexistent. So there is perhaps for me an idea of the ultimate sacred nature of the divine, which lies under all our various experiences and which can be accessed often at very unexpected moments, but can't really be pinned down. So I would say an elusive something that I think we all recognise but can't actually put into a nice little box.
Thank you so much. Giles, what's your take on this?
Well, just to, I suppose, build on that, the sacred, I think I would define as that which always exceeds the possibility of finite description or capture. So both as an analytic category, but also in a sense as an ethical category, and indeed as a kind of narrative or storytelling category. It's something that will always elude the claims that we want to make on it. I think I'd also want to see it in a way that slightly troubles the kind of binary that the sacred as a term implies with the profane. That can be in some ways perhaps an unhelpful binary. It's one that I think in Christian traditions is always being negotiated and renegotiated. So in the Christian tradition, Christians would believe that Jesus is the personification, right, of the sacred. So the sacred is personal as a category. In Matthew 25, Jesus identifies himself in this kind of story of the Last Judgment with the needy, with the hungry, the thirsty, those in prison, those who are sick. So there's a sense of the location of the sacred itself in places where, in a sense, you would least expect to find it. And so I think that kind of personal identification of the sacred and then its extension radically into kind of suffering and needy humanity rather problematizes or overcomes, or at least insists on a kind of paradox in our understanding of where the sacred is located and the sorts of claims that it makes on us.
That's really interesting. We're already unpacking a lot so far. Bill, how would you answer the question?
So first of all, I want to appreciate that people have just spoken, and particularly in your beginning. I too don't think the sacred is a thing. It's not a thing at all. And yet it insistently, always, everywhere, cries out and makes its offer of presence to us, not least, and perhaps in a very special way, in our own interiority. I've tried to swim into that as deeply as I could, and I can't find any bottom whatsoever. And so, for me, I've had the pleasure of being with people who I would describe as being radically translucent to the sacred. And their being so translucent did not in any way annul their being itself. In fact, it illumined their being. And I think in such cases as the question that you're posing, that and this is what I've done, in addition to plumbing my own experience, I look at those highly cultivated souls and hearts and see evidence in them for how the sacred is reflected in people who are not first and foremost sacred, although the boundary between the sacred and themselves is extremely permeable. Thank you.
Thank you both. Riya, how would you interpret the sacred?
It's difficult to go after all of that, but I think for me the sacred is really this unyielding, undying pulse and rhythm of the universe that lives within each person, and it's present within us all. And I think how I see it is more of a reaching. So you reach outward, beyond separation, beyond division, towards wholeness, but also at the same time, like you said, Bill, I think it's also about reaching inward and finding a place from where to meet with that wholeness outside. And I think it's very special that we can't define it, and that it doesn't have contours, and that we can't put it into a box, because I think that's what keeps helps us cherish the mystery of what it is, and really ask the questions that we need to ask of each other and ourselves. So yeah, that's how I see it.
Thank you so much. I wonder, we've been talking about sacred as the concept, and many people who might not have maybe delved as deeply into the concept of what sacred is, if you ask the person on the street what they think sacred is, they might think, oh, it's to do with religion, it's to do with faith. I wonder, Ankur, do you see the sacred as something linked to religion or faith, or something inherently fluid and something that would cross religious divides?
Yeah, so as I indicated in my previous attempted definition of the sacred, I would see very much so the sacred as a fluid, somewhat malleable category. Not so much something that can be categorized precisely or classified in terms of A or B or C, as some type of a horizon on which we are moving towards a point, and the point keeps on receding from our grasp. So one way to look at the category of the sacred, especially in my own thinking, in my own living, in my own research, is in terms of, let's say, a style of philosophical anthropology or theological anthropology, which is just a very basic, which is just a very big term for how the category or the concept of the anthropos, the human, is understood on different philosophical or theological landscapes. And when we look at religion or the sense of the sacred through this lens of philosophical or theological anthropology, we find that on these different theological or philosophical landscapes, the category of the anthropos, or the human, is often very densely embedded in the sense of narrative. So there is a cosmic narrative about why we are here in the first place, how did we get here, why is the world in such a mess, what should we do to prevent this mess, what is waiting for us, if anything, on the other side, what is the nature of the hereafter, How do we chart a moral pathway or a trajectory between now and then? So all of these are the big questions. And each one of us as human beings in our lives, we may choose to borrow or model our lives on one such big cosmic narrative as a template, as an exemplar. And what happens when there is a gap between what the cosmic narrative tells us we should be doing and what our own existential narrative says? Let's say there's a cosmic narrative says, by the age of 30, you should get married and find a job. But let's say I'm 55 years old, I haven't done neither, right? So there is a kind of a gap, there is a type of a deficit between the grand cosmic narrative, the grand narrative of meaning, and my own individual existence. And how we navigate that gap is, I would say, is where the question of the sacred comes in. Because the sacred can give us some values, some ideas, through which we can calibrate pathways that help us to navigate that gap. Therefore, for some of us, these values or these idioms could be quote-unquote secular. For some, it could be quote-unquote religious. But whatever else we are carrying out exercises in what I just now described as philosophical anthropology.
I know that some of your research looks at Hindu-Muslim relations. Can you think of or share with us maybe an example of how that sort of fluidity of the sacred might cross boundaries in a practical sense between these religious communities?
So in a very practical sense, across many parts of South Asia, by which I mean India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, some of the dargahs or some of the shrines of Sufi masters have operated for about 300, 400, 500 years now as synthetic sites of this kind of transition, where, say, Hindu women may go to a dargah to offer thanksgiving after a safe childbirth. So the idea is that these Sufi shrines, one of the reasons why they have acted, why they have operated as these sites of synthetic borrowings, and what I referred to earlier as this malleability of the sense of the sacred, is because of certain theological, philosophical ideas about self-negation. And the idea is that one of the ways to develop or to generate self-negation is through an allegory of love. So love is a power that helps us to decenter ourselves from our self-absorption. And love decenters us and redirects us to the beloved, whether the human beloved or the divine beloved. Now, Muslims in India, South Asia, and Hindus in South Asia, they can both speak this language, and they do. And when they do, their language is rooted in Sanskrit texts on the one hand, and some of these Perso-Arabic texts, but there's a deep conceptual resonance. So when Muslims speak this language, they will use the language of Fana, they will use the language of maybe Wahadat al-Wujud and so on, and Hindus use the language of Prema and Bhakti. But there is this deep similarity of the language of ego-negation in the light of the cosmic gravitation of the divine beloved. And this shared vocabulary has sometimes, not always, sometimes operated, as I say, as a synthetic site where Hindus are able to say, okay, these Muslims are not so weird after all. I mean, they seem also to have similar vocabularies. And likewise, Muslims say, okay, I see what you did just now, although I do not quite read your Sanskrit texts. At least I know that this is the language of loss, of lament, of lamentation, of love and longing. So sometimes, as we know, that the language of suffering, the language of loss and lamentation has greater binding power than the binding power of studying texts and doctrines and theology. So that would be one concrete example.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting, thank you. Lindsey, you spoke earlier about perhaps not using the term sacred so much yourself, and I wonder, how do you think the term sacred lands with perhaps people who don't identify as religious, or indeed those who come from more conservative religious traditions? How do you think it's an exclusionary or inclusionary term for those, how it lands with?
I think for people from conservative religious backgrounds, you have to find the language. You have to find how concepts of the sacred. If I go and talk to Hasidic Jews in Stanford Hill and say, "What's your feeling about sacred?" I think there'll be a certain sort of, that's a very outsider word, and I'd have to say, do you do any practice of people do it, or various there are all sorts of Hasidic deeply spiritual meditation practices, and then they would know what I was talking about. So the sacred is a sort of an abstract concept devoid of relationship to people's religious lives. I think it's hard for many people. I think for people outside religious traditions, it's terribly off-putting very often. And you have to appeal, or if you want to talk about that, you have to find metaphor situations where people may have found some sort of reaction, like wonders of nature. It's very, very common. So it seems to be a universal human reaction that in situations of extreme beauty and splendor of nature, people feel a sense of awe and impression. So I think you would have to appeal to people's lived experience and pedal back on terms, and it's a bit like the text and doctrine things. People relate much better, and they can. I'm sure people can all discuss this, but you'd have to find the way in via their personal lived experience to make it really something that they can talk about and engage with.
Absolutely. So, Bill, you have been one of the driving forces behind this book. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about the vision of Retelling Sacred Stories, and, you know, how would you explain what a shared sacred story is?
So first of all, let me build on my colleague here's remarks, both of them, and indicate that this work was dealing with 9 traditions. So we couldn't use the word eternal Buddha as the title of the book, or we couldn't use Allah as the title of the book. And we couldn't use any particular tradition-specific symbol which was linked and in fact was evoked by the very experience that they found language for, a symbolic language, because it doesn't point to a thing at all. So instead, we did something that we all felt, and I'm speaking of 150 really extraordinary, deeply committed religious scholars. We decided to use the word sacred, and the weaknesses that you point out are real, and I respect them very deeply. But we decided to use the word sacred with the injunction to the reader to substitute the symbol that is either their most precious symbol as a tradition or their own personal language. So we use the word sacred in a very unusual way. We use it as a placeholder that each tradition and even each person is invited to inflect in their way. Now, the conviction, I think, is, and it's an extension of what I've just shared, the conviction among all that were involved in this work is that the sacred is more interior than we are to ourselves. It's not alien from us. It abides at a level that is, as I said, more interior than we are to ourselves. And that we live in a time where that term, or the more specific symbols that term is a placeholder for, have been privatized. They no longer pertain to our public life. We've figured out that we can try to talk to each other with no reference to the sacred, even though our experiences may be highly plural. And the entire project was concerned that if we sever ourselves from the sacred, and we do that personally, we do that culturally, we sever ourselves from ourselves, and both as persons and as society. Now, it still allows the myriad inflections, the plural inflections of the term. We have no pretense that it doesn't. And so we ultimately, that severance was deemed by the entire cohort, extended cohort, as a profound distorting, a truncating, a narrowing down of what it really means to be a person, and a narrowing down of what it really means to be a society, and a narrowing down of the radiance that declares itself to us at all times and all places in what we call the natural world and its web of life. That those are saturated with a radiance that is reflective of something that is not an object for us. So our interest there was practical. We needed to find a cipher that wasn't perfect because we couldn't find a perfect cipher. And we needed to use that cipher so that it could be inflected by each tradition or each person in their own way, so that that plurality of experiences of the sacred could find a way to both honor their very specific particularity and yet be aligned for all of us. All of Buddhism being really Buddhism, but how is that helping us? How is it in solidarity with us? Or the Hindu resplendent diversity, how is that a heritage of sacred sacred exploration that actually has radical salience for all of our well-being? And so too is each tradition. So we had a very deeply strategic intentionality. We live in a worldview, and one that does not allow the sacred to be acknowledged, and is vexed because we have different notions of the sacred. So we default back to less. We even try to do our work, but then express it in a worldview that is not adequate to it. So ultimately, we felt we have a worldview problem. Its beauty is that it's plural, the sacred is plural, and could we align the plural traditions of the sacred for our common good and for the good of the full community of being, grounded in the sacred in our respective traditions, ways of understanding. So it was a practical compromise term. We just didn't find one better. And so we bow to your sense that it's not perfect. And if you think of something down the road, kind of give me a note if you don't mind. So thank you so much.
On the power of storytelling,
Yeah.
I think you refer to it as sacred stories as the most ubiquitous religious form.
Yes.
Which I find really interesting.
Yeah.
And how do you think storytelling can help us all to rediscover a shared sense of the sacred? So talk us through sort of getting to the point of a shared sacred.
Okay. Wonderful question, and thank you for inviting me to reflect on it. First of all, we had these 9 really extraordinary scholar practitioner teams. These were practicing people in their faith heritage. They were deeply mature in their spiritualities, but they were scholars too. They understood their heritage in a very refined fashion. They were also contemporary citizens. They were men and women who were living at this moment and with the perils and the promises of this time. So first of all, we asked each tradition to tell their sacred story honestly, with creative fidelity, but to tell it from a very special perspective. You can tell stories from as many perspectives as you choose. We had one perspective. Tell that story to the human family about how your tradition's experience of the sacred grounds you in radical solidarity for the flourishing of the human family and the full community of being. So it's a very particular ask of each of those traditions. Be faithful, be creatively faithful, we tell it in our time, but tell it for how your tradition gives you an experience of the sacred that grounds you in solidarity of love, mercy, compassion for all of us and the community of being. That was a pre-step to do something which was daring, dangerous, but deeply needed. And that was to try to tell a shared sacred story that would never replace the individual sacred stories. It simply couldn't do that. In fact, it would actually really be told largely through those stories in a variety of ways. But to tell a shared sacred story that allowed, in the very telling of the story, the invitation to the reader, use your own symbol of the sacred as you read this story. Test the story. We didn't tell the nationality of the protagonists of this story. We didn't tell their religious affiliations. We set them in a refugee camp, something we're all basically fearing at one level or the other as our world is in great peril. And could you find in that situation the seeds of a shared sacred worldview? Is there a bit of heaven that's accessible in hell? The very hell that looms in front of us, and in fact, where many of us already live in terms of the hell on earth. If it doesn't hold up there, it doesn't hold up. And so we did this, and if I'll take one more minute, if I may. It's a big burden on the listener, I realize. But we did this not because we simply felt that we ought to try to do this. We went back to your infancy, all of our infancies. All of us were held before we were verbal. All of us had some form of cooing occurring, in which, you know this from your own experience, the radiance of the infant's smile erupted. This was a form of mutuality. This was a pre-verbal, I feel recognized by you, and I know that you recognize me. And this, ultimately, this mutuality can be comported at an extremely deep level. The heart, the Hindu heart, open to the sacred, can see the other heart, who is not Hindu, as open to the sacred. And they have very different doctrines. They have very different conceptions of the sacred, but they feel recognized. And they even say to each other, I know what you mean. I'd say it differently. But the key was, I know what you mean. So the scholars, with their extraordinary repository of scholarly and historical and theological acumen, weren't at all equipped to write a shared sacred story based on that alone. When they achieved a sufficient degree of what I'm going to call as transcendent mutuality, where the little smiles occurred on their face, not at all dissimilar from the radiant smile of the infant as the infant is being first recognized, then we were equipped, because that mutuality was sufficiently deep that it could hold us in our differences. And now we were equipped to try, to do our best, to try with our hearts, hearts that were in tune with each other in our difference and could hold it, to write a sacred tale, knowing that it would have to be retold and retold and improved and improved. But the key was that would hold and seed a sacred worldview. And we could further blow that out or give the heuristics of that. And the problems that won't be solved within a worldview that excludes the sacred then have a different sort of ability to both frame problem, challenge, promise, and a vast range of resource, odd word, of sacred linked capacity to respond for our common weal, our well-being, our flourishing in the world. So that's where we were aiming. And it's a long road. I'm sorry I had to paddle that way, but Your patience is deeply, deeply appreciated. So thank you.
And I like that phrase of, I know what you mean. I might say it a bit differently.
Yes.
And Riya, I wondered what your reflections on that are, and this I guess, tension between universality and difference. And do you think that there is a way to speak about this shared sacred without, erasing those important differences that people have from their own faith traditions?
Yes, thank you. And I really think the book is a good example of that, really, of trying to celebrate difference, but also not forget to speak, not speak from our differences, not hold on to them so strongly that they become a barrier to our meeting with the sacred. So I think it's really a question, the question here for me is really, how do you cultivate that spirit to be able to see, as you said, Bill, about really how do you respond to somebody with that, that's the spirit that we're looking to cultivate. And I think one thing that occurred to me when I read the book is that there's always a teacher. There's this sense of teaching. We can teach this cultivation of spirit. We can really, I think, learn from other people, whether it's a teacher, a master of some sort, and I think learning that and realizing that we have to unlearn certain things to be able to learn the sense of celebration where difference is concerned. Also looking at difference as uniqueness, rather than not as othering, but really, what is it that makes you special? What is it that makes your tradition special? And as Krista Stendhal said, holy envy, like really looking at somebody else's religion and saying, I love that, or that their tradition, and thinking, how wonderful would it be if I could meet with that in my tradition, or what can I learn in my tradition from that? So I think really holding space for differences is really about cultivating that spirit first, and then it is definitely possible, as we have seen and as we continue to see with people who are doing the work on the ground. But I do think it is a concerted, a very conscious effort that we need to make to do that.
The phrase holy envy, it's a great one. Giles, what are your reflections on the conversation so far on that phrase?
I think that's really helpful in holy envy as something that really emerged for me reading a number of the retellings of each of these stories and these sort of sparks of recognition. I think to use a kind of analogy thinking about languages, I think there's a degree of wishful thinking if what we think we're doing is creating a kind of spiritual Esperanto, right? That's something which is kind of which is the danger at the beginning of a description of a project like this. You might well think, well, this is we're seeking something which can transcend these differences and which is always about these moments of mutual recognition and that relegates difference to something that is, as it were, phenomenal, right? That there's something sort of more profound here that doesn't, in a sense, recognise the deep metaphysical differences that there are in these traditions, as well as the sort of ephemera, as it were, of doctrinal formulations or particular practices, even as there are these kinds of mixing. So to see this as an exercise, this is about making us more conversant with our own traditions and with other traditions, right? So if it's an act of translation rather than a replacement, as it were, or a sort of seeing through or beyond, then I think that's a deeply valuable exercise. And that's certainly what I made, in a sense, the mistake, I think, of reading the very first essay, which was this sense of a kind of reduction almost, that here is the sort of the bare essentials that we can all agree on. And then when, for me, I saw it opening up again in each of these individual stories, that you can then see as sort of anticipated, as it were, in this telling, it becomes a really profound exercise in speaking from within and between traditions.
Thank you.
There's a lot currently spoken about with regards to shared values. And I guess it's not, a phrase we've used so far in this discussion, but in sort of the wider world, governments, organizations, companies, universities all speak about shared values, which does speak to some of the heart of this book. But I do wonder if any of you have thoughts on if there's a negative side to the discourse of shared values that might be sort of a slight undercurrent that might be exclusionary or perhaps harmful.
Let others go, but I have something to share with that. Let others go first, please.
Giles, did you have anything?
What's negative about shared values?
Well, I think particularly with regards to religions, you might have religious figures or people using the guise of religion to talk about shared values in a way that would actually exclude others. it's not faithful to the religion.
Yeah.
And we might see this in some forms of Christian or Hindu nationalism, Muslim
Yeah.
nationalism, any type of nationalism.
Yeah, no, okay, absolutely, yes. I mean, I think that's exactly the way in which we then need to come back into a sort of specific refraction of the sacred, right? That it is not a neutral term as it is at work in the world, and it can be at work as that which stands in a sense beyond question. It can legitimate all sorts of things that really need to be questioned and are properly questioned. And that, again, I think is where the sort of hard work of kind of interreligious dialogue and a certain kind of openness is really, really important. And again, I think that in some ways comes back to perhaps a more proper understanding of the sacred, as we were sort of talking about it at the very beginning, as something that is in a sense always exceeding or eluding any particular claim for capture or representation. So if it is used in a sort of utterly exclusive and exclusionary sense, that's something which it seems to me that a proper relationship from within one's own tradition towards the sacred is always going to be questioning quite how much of a grasp you and your community really have on it.
Yeah.
It is always undoing the sorts of attachments that we want to put on it.
Riya, you've been nodding quite heavily. I'm sure you've got thoughts.
Trying to gather them. I think the challenge there is, I think that is a result of when we become really self-righteous about or what we think we know about our traditions, and I think it really needs for us to look within our traditions to understand if we're really meeting them in meeting that wholeness, like I was talking about before. Like, are we really looking inward to meet with that wholeness? And if we are, then exclusion is not a part of that. But I think people, yes, use it for their own, whatever political agendas, things like that. But I do think that it is very much about looking inwards and trying to understand what is your tradition, or what are all these people speaking to me about, all the people who've come before, all the people in these traditions, the people who we're learning from, whatever these scriptures are, what the text that we're reading, what are they actually saying to us? And again, I think if the intent is to, and this is where I think having the idea of the sacred, whether or not it meets with all of our, needs, is really important, because when you have that intent, then, and you're working towards that intent, then you're careful perhaps about, the exclusion. Well, this is what I like to think. I know it's very hard work, and it really takes a lot out of you to be able to do that. But again, people do it. So I think the question to ask is also like, how do you do that? What are people doing? So, you said you have some
Well, I'm speaking as one who spent almost 3 decades in multi-religious work. And there was a formula, and it was to discern the deeply held and widely shared. And then you could build a consensus on the deeply held and widely shared. Now that formula has strengths, and in some contexts, it's the only available formula. In 1947, there was the second international conference in San Francisco for UNESCO. UNESCO charged with marshaling the civilizational wealth of the human family to advance peace. And a keynote speaker, a person I never met, but whose work I'm familiar with, noted, because remember, this is in the aftermath of the Second War, so you've got China in the gallery, you've got the Soviet bloc in the gallery, you've got India, you've got all sorts of different secular states, religiously affiliated states. So here we are. It's the human family and the ravages after the ravages of the Second World War. So in the keynote speech, it happened to be a French philosopher by the name of Jacques Maritain, he noted that consensus on what it means to be a person, what it means to be a society, what it means to understand in terms of the depth of reality, maybe having to use the word sacred again here, no consensus possible. The only consensus could be the deeply held and widely shared. But notice that we don't know why. Why do you ground that care? What's the grounds of your care? We're mute. We can't talk about it. We don't have the ability not to insult each other or trespass on each other's grounds for the common care. Now, multi-religious cooperation basically took that model over. And what does that do? So we're here, all of us, different religions, and there's an urgent issue that we all care about. And so what we do is we check each other. Do we all really care about this? And if we do, well, great. What can we do about it? And so the wheel starts to turn. And a lot of good things happen, by the way. That's a model that I've seen produce not insignificant outputs. But notice what happens. The various, if we were all religious in this room, the various notions of the sacred stay under the table. And when we get our consensus, we revert back to the common secular world in which we're going to try to prosecute our deeply held and widely shared care. So there's a profound distorting that takes place in that formula because we revert back not to our tradition's sacred worldview. We revert back to a least common denominator because we didn't feel we could face the complexity of the Hindu heritage vis-a-vis other heritages in the room and so forth. That has a decentering quality to it. It subtly invites you to accommodate to the common world we can work with, but that's the common world that's been cut off from the sacred. We've abstained from it because we might offend each other, and this isn't the space to go into decades of debate, of dialogue about our differences and so forth. So what I observe personally is that although a lot of wonderful work happens, I regard there being two tents. There's the biggest tent. That's the whole human family. And we've got to use the deeply held and widely shared in that, with that family. And there's the second biggest tent. It's about 80%. And it's people who are rooted in some vision of the sacred. So to remove the sacred and stick it under the table and not figure out a way in which we can safely ground our care in our respective experiences of the sacred means that we will not publicly recognize that the biggest asset we have to address this problem is our experience of the sacred, our experience of sacred love, our experience of sacred mercy, our experience of sacred compassion. And that all the other things that we are doing, the other virtues that we would like to deploy in trying to address the crisis du jour, the issue at hand, or even the positive to be advanced, is in a certain way been cut off from the deepest source of conviction, care, love, mercy. So what we tried to do is to safely bring that, that's why we had to use the clumsy word, that everybody can treat in their own way. We wanted to bring that back onto the top of the table. Back on the top of the table that didn't require everybody to be a multi-religious scholar, but bring it back on the top of the table so that your experience of the sacred is aligned with my different experience of the sacred to advance our respective forms of solidarity for the flourishing of the community of being. So there's a very practical impact of being safely allowing the sacred in its diverse iterations, its diversity, to come back onto the table of being the very source and being the very power of discerning the deeply held and widely care. When I did lots of conflict resolution work and went to Norway or any other government or any foundation, I would talk about the spiritual assets, the social assets, the moral assets. I talked about the social assets, the panoply of religious infrastructure in the countries involved, and they're profound moral assets. And I had State Departments or Foreign Service offices nodding their heads, yeah. And then I would speak about sacred assets. Wait a second, this may be too hot to touch. This is part of the problem, right?
Yeah.
So I soon learned, don't talk about that when you're trying to get money from people for whom that's not music. But I never felt satisfied with it. And so this is a maturation of a long process that many beyond this room, our traditions have all been involved in. And I know it can be vastly improved upon. And so it's a baby step. But that's how we learn to walk.
Lindsey, I wondered if you have thoughts on this notion of sort of whether we call it sacred or religious or these traditions and the power of that in helping to sort of work across boundaries to build something better in a world where that is constantly, as Bill said, sort of put onto the table, religion or the sacred. It's, very much in a world that operates within the secular framework.
I think it's a huge problem. I quite understand why you use sacred. It's very hard because there are so many people who just find it very alienating, past experiences, their preconceptions of religion. And several studies have been done about, as many of the traditional religious structures in this country dwindle, the fact that actually the prevalence of people considering themselves, the word is usually spiritual, has maintained its level or even risen, while official religion contracts. I think that's part of the sort of visibility of this problem. And the problem really boils down to how do you entice people in? Because once they're in the game, you go, oh yes, as you said, I know what this is, I know what you mean. But it's getting, I don't really have any slick answers for this, how you get people in, because the automatic reaction can often be, that's not for me, I'm not a religious person. And there was, thinking of a study by Linda Woodhead where she contrasted the idea of religious people, spiritual people, and found that the word religion, literally, many people did not see it as relevant, whereas they came up with perfectly spiritual, religious views all the time, and were very much at peace with this. So it's something to do with phraseology, it's something to do with the way, as you say, the way things are currently set up in education, in government structures and what have you, to exclude the sacred. It's become a bit of a, I wouldn't say a dirty word, but an embarrassing word for many people. And I'm honestly not quite sure many people will be reached. Anyone who says, oh yes, that speaks to me. It's the reaching the people who probably would be happy once in, but can't take that step across. That's that sort of frisson of disquiet with the way it's labelled. And I'm really sorry, I don't have a lovely, beautiful solution.
If you had a solution, everyone wouldn't need the book. I want to move on to this question of art and beauty and culture, and how, what the role of art and beauty is in trying to access or touch on the sacred, whether it's fiction, whether it's music, how can we, is there a way that can maybe help us touch the sacred in a way that formal dialogues may not? And I know many of you are interested in this topic, so please let me know if you want to say anything on it.
Maybe I just something. So I think one part of the discussion we have been having so far is about how to negotiate this dialectic of universality and particularity. So on the one hand, we are all universally members of Homo sapiens, but we have very dense, concrete forms of particularity. So we have our own autobiographical self, our socio-cultural profile, our socio-economic location, our childhood upbringing, our psychological temperament, and all of these are quite diverse, and yet they do not quite prevent us from having sometimes at least a meaningful dialogue. So to give you one concrete example of how I have tried to navigate, or I have been compelled by life to navigate some of these tensions, as it so happens for various complex reasons I won't outline now, The first 15 to 18 years of my life, I lived in a very religiously diverse environment with Hindu, Muslim, and Roman Catholic friends, acquaintances, and relatives through inter-religious marriage. And again, through some various complicated reasons, I either consciously picked up or I self-consciously learned to sing various forms of sacred music, Indo-Islamic, and of course Roman Catholic Christian hymns. Now, there is one very common theme that runs through quite a lot of the music I sing in languages such as Hindi, Bengali, Assamese, Gujarati, and English, and in Urdu. So the idea is very simple. The idea is like this, that such is the beauty of the Divine Lord, that the beauty of the Divine Lord will decenter your egocentricity and recenter you in the Divine Beloved. Right? So again, I repeat, such is the beauty of the Divine Lord, that the beauty of the Divine Lord will decenter your egocentricity and recenter you in the Divine Love. Now I'm saying this sentence in English. You can say this in Arabic, in Persian, in Sanskrit, in Bengali, in Assamese, in Hindi, in Urdu, and they will sound very different. Because the language they will use is language from the Quran, language from the Hebrew Bible, language from the Greek New Testament, language from the Sanskrit Upanishad. Now, over those 18 to 20 years, I realized that to my Muslim friends, I should not sing some of these songs. To my Hindu friends, I should not sing some of those other songs. And in church, when I'm talking about some of my Roman Catholic friends, those songs definitely should not be sung. Although they all share this universal theme, that such is the love of the Divine Beloved that it will decenter you. So that is what I mean by how the fact that I'm not giving a lecture on Christian doctrine or on Hindu philosophy or on some type of Indo-Islamic theology, my Muslim friends, they know that I also sing those other songs. And they know that I can't be that weird after all, because I'm singing those songs which I like so much. Like my Christian friends, they know that I also sing those Muslim songs, but how weird can I be? Because I can sing those songs too, right? So, as a result of that, through music, I realized that self-consciously I've been able to mediate some of these borderlines. I could not do in a peer-reviewed academic article. Because in just about 9,000 words, what can you say, right? Or even in a lecture. But if I were to sing one of these songs by choosing very carefully which song to sing, I say, okay, is the language too Sanskrit? Is the language too much from the Quran? Is the language too much from the Hebrew Bible, the Christian New Testament? Depending on the audience, I sing a slightly different song with the same theme of negation of self-centeredness in the call of the Divine Beloved who is supremely beautiful.
Beautiful. Bravo.
Riya, you're a poet, so I'm sure you've got thoughts to build on what Ankur was just talking about.
Yeah, I really love that aspect of the Divine Beloved, really beautiful. I think it's really wonderful how so much of art is actually, I don't know if everybody can relate, but so much of art is created when you suffer. So much poetry and writing and literature and just music comes from human agony. And so also from our, the places of wonder and awe and love and all of the beautiful things as well. But I think both of these aspects are part of the sacred. So, suffering is a part of, at least the way I see it, but suffering is definitely a part of the sacred. It really helps us see each other, understand each other's pain. And so from that perspective, I think art is really created from the sacred. And then and also then it becomes a response to the sacred. And there's always this beautiful kind of meeting. And when it's created from that space, it calls to everybody. So you could listen to a song that you don't understand the lyrics to, and you could feel deeply. I mean, I have many, many times been moved by songs in languages that I do not speak, don't understand. But there is something in them that I know, it's a place of knowing. And I think I lost my train of thought, but that is actually what I wanted to share about art. And I think the beauty of it is that it creates a language for the sacred, just really the things that we cannot express and we cannot define, they come through us and they will meet with us in all of these art forms and ways that, I think that's how I would perceive it.
And Giles, you do a lot of sort of work on literature, and I wonder if you have thoughts on some of that as an art form.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting thinking about the category of art and of music are perhaps sometimes narrative categories, not always. Obviously, literature very often has, I suppose lyric poetry might be slightly different, but very often has form of narrative, and I think reconnects with this question of storytelling. And I'm very interested in, particularly in tragedy, and it really struck what we were saying about suffering. I mean, tragedy is very intensely concerned with suffering, with what causes suffering, with how we respond to suffering, with what it means to be constituted as a community that comes together intentionally to reflect on suffering, thinking especially of the kind of origins of tragic drama in a kind of liturgical actually very closely connected to the sacred. You know, this is a divine right that's being celebrated in some sense, and that's something I think that persists in a curious way in many subsequent forms of drama, at least in kind of Western traditions. And one of the things I think is very interesting about tragedy, for example, the way it reflects on suffering, is that it operates, I think, in a way that is rather like the sacred, or perhaps is one of the ways it's connected to the sacred, that it Rowan Williams has a very nice way of putting it. He thinks about how tragedy exposes us to things that are true about ourselves that we would rather not know or that we habitually deny. You know, the forms of injustice, for example, that are structures of living are supporting and embodying. And it therefore becomes a way of the community reflecting on how it is failing to be the community that it is called to be, in a sense. So there is a way, I think, rather like what Ankur was saying, actually, about the kind of decentering of the ego that can work at a sort of more communal level as well, for allowing us to question, you know, in particular ways, but precisely because of its aesthetic form, because of its communal experience, in ways that other modes of discourse, perhaps, and are not quite so readily able to access.
Thank you. I want to bring in the audience and allow you to have the chance to participate as well. And just before we go into Q&A, I understand that we have one of the other scholar practitioners who contributed to the book in the audience, Zain. Where are you, Zain? There you are, at the back. Zain, I wondered if you had anything to contribute about sort of your experience of creating art. And I understand that about Arabic poetry or your input into the sacred story in this book.
Yeah, so my role was, I was part of the Muslim group, so we were 10 scholar practitioners, and we were mandated to write a story that is representative of Islam, a sacred story. So, but I want to comment on this idea of, so our mandate was also to write something that literary also, that has a literary value in it. And that was a challenge because literature, when it touches the sacred, it gets very complicated. So we know, for example, that we have a scholar of Blake here. So Blake commented on Milton. He said he's from the devil's party without knowing. So there is a quality of literature that is also somehow not conformative. It's not conformative. So to task literature to write about goodness, then we can get into some complications. But I think art is a natural ally of solidarity because of two reasons. One is that art, just like religion, attempts to transcend physical and mental and economical boundaries, barriers, and bars, or presupposed limits. So in that sense, it is very useful to be used for solidarity because we can choose to position ourselves in a place of benefit, of service to others. And the other reason is that art, also like a prayer, art is regenerative, has a regenerative quality because it can be read anew with each reading, with each reiteration. So in that sense, just like a prayer, in each vocation can also become something new and valuable. And in this book, we try to do it through something we call resonance. So resonance is not is not similarities, is not a way of trying to compare between these different traditions, but a way of trying just to say, okay, this is how we say it in our tradition, but maybe you have something, or maybe not, something similar to this. So there's some sort of analogous wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your contribution. I'd like to open it to the floor. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists? Don't be shy. If not, we'll start. Yes. I think there's a microphone as well that's just coming.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the interesting talk on these questions. I just thought, wonderful, you spent a lot of time talking about the importance of the sacred and people who value the sacred. And of course, we live in societies that are increasingly secular. Many people are non-religious, atheists, humanists, and the way you're speaking, it sounds as if they have no part to play in this, that they're perhaps somehow outside bounds of the people who are moral and good, and of course, our ideas are something very different. But of course, very often it's humanists rather than religious people uphold sort of morality and these other sort of values we're looking for. So I wondered sort of perhaps if you could say something about why you stress this notion of this sacred sort of so strongly, and how might sort of humanists fit in the story as well. And perhaps also why aren't they included in the book, as if like another sort of tradition that we could look to.
Thank you so much. I want to build whether this is one for you to take.
Sure. First of all, it's a perfectly good question, and the intent of the question has my great sympathy, so I thank you for it. There's other books that can be written, so there's no pretense that this book completes the library, so to speak. So that's an honest answer. There is another answer, though, is that religions, in all of their differences, are somewhat uniquely interested in the whole, all of reality. The sacred is experienced as the source or the ground of all reality that we call the cosmos, but for practical terms, we narrow down to the earth and its web of life, society and persons as the kind of community of being. So that quality that religions share, they're making a claim. We're talking about the fullness of reality. We're talking about it as Buddhists, or we're talking about it as any of the other religions, has a quality that is distinctive from other very beautiful associations of people. And in the work to try to give a more heuristic sketch of the shared sacred worldview that's in the shared sacred story, it's the person as potentially whole because the person is related to the source of all reality and everything grounded in it. The notion of the society as a potential whole of whole people. And so there are all sorts of people that have very important contributions to make, and we respect that. I respect it. We all know that some of the most extraordinary people we've ever met are people that don't fit or don't like to be pigeonholed in some way as religious. So that's fair. Your concern for them is fair. But we had a different problem, to be honest with you. I don't think there was a single person involved with this project that didn't respect people who did not find themselves declaring themselves to be religious or dishonor them or devalue them. That was never the point. The point was that these different communities with their visions of whole and their visions of consummate flourishing of that whole were shared in different ways across the religious communities. In actual fact, let me counter you sweetly, but counter you. The minority has captured the public worldview. The non-religious have captured the public worldview. I am on a working committee, a very distinguished one, related to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Those are the goals not for the disadvantaged. Those are the goals for all of the nations. They were negotiated. They're torturous. They're multiple measures. And just for an experiment, I went to Grok 3 and I asked Grok 3, what is the implicit worldview of the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Well, didn't take Grok long. It answered about a secular worldview, period. And I knew that because you can read those goals and you will never find the word truth, goodness, beauty, honesty, courage, the sacred. Those words don't exist in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the goals we're trying to achieve for our flourishing. Then I put in the paper that was derived from the book, a sort of heuristic of shared sacred flourishing, and I asked Grok, transpose those UN development goals that come from the basically in control of public discourse, and transpose them into the shared sacred worldview. Well, suddenly, amazingly, all sorts of resources appear when they're repositioned in the shared sacred worldview that are absolutely essential to those goals getting realized, and goals not mentioned arise as central for the flourishing of the human family. So I'm doing this sweetly because I think the people you're talking about run the court at the present time. They have the worldview that we all genuflect somewhat to in our public lives. So they're not unrepresented. They hold court. And the 80% are squeezed for the reasons I described, because we don't agree on our visions of the sacred. So point well taken, point deeply honored, but also recognition that there's been a estrangement from the public square of the longest continuous conversations about what it means to be a human person and to flourish as a community. So we were aware that that's the environment we were working in. So that seemed to us, since it's not the last book to get written, justification enough to take on a task that we were daunted by to begin with.
Thank you.
You take my goodwill, because I took yours, and I respect it very, very deeply.
Thank you for answering that question. Do we have any other questions?
Thank you all so much. I was really struck.
There's just a microphone coming.
Oh, sorry. I was really struck by your question, how do we cultivate a spirit? And so I wonder whether I might dare to ask the panelists if they have a response to that. Mm-hmm. How do we cultivate, and particularly in the UK when humanities are being cut in favour of STEM over and over again, and the arts are being cut, how do we cultivate that spirit of ability to celebrate difference but recognise what is common?
Thank you. Lindsay, can I go to you? Do you have any? Oh dear. We could go to someone else.
I'll have a go. I think what we need to do is look for best practice. We need to look at what is succeeding, what is likely to succeed, and my instincts say it's bottom up. And I look at things like the Joan Cox Foundation, which is seeking to create and strengthen senses of community by doing some very everyday things like having street parties, getting people together. It sounds small, it sounds pathetic, but they're building something. And I know of several low-level, out of the headlines movements, local groups that are taking matters into their own hands. And I can think of many, many, many interfaith examples, which are unknown to most people, but an overlapping mosaic of local particular efforts of people meeting people is remarkably effective. And it creates not only relationships, it creates mutual respect. I've seen this in interfaith stuff I've done. You just go, you meet people on what level? There are hundreds of different levels. Scriptural reasoning is one, sitting together and comparing wedding customs is another. You know, there are many ways to do this. And they do build community, and they do build respect, and they do build understanding. So I would definitely encourage that level. I think basically we're probably going to need many techniques, we're going to need many programs, but looking around and seeing what is working quite well at the moment definitely indicates possible channels to reinforce, to subsidize, to promote, and talking about stories. I do know of remarkable storytellers just in this country. I know of a pair of Jewish and Muslim storytellers who go around together to schools, to all sorts of places, and I can't imagine what their effect is, but I imagine it's pretty major. That idea of master storytellers sharing stories or bringing a story each from their own tradition and presenting to a group of people who then become somehow part of that little storytelling community. Because, as we know, stories are incredibly powerful. Everyone loves a story. It works across the generations. It works across all cultures. So, yeah, I would do multi-pronged stuff. And I would look at the grassroots first and see what's working and how that can be developed, supported, and then maybe look at higher levels.
I think we've got some thoughts.
That's beautiful, thank you. I just wanted to add, I mean, I know it sounds very redundant, but really, friendship, how can we make friends with people different from us? I think our example becomes really powerful in the communities that we live in. And more I feel like we silo ourselves into, you know, familiar spaces and people who are familiar to us, and we understand that familiarity. But I think friendship is a powerful way, and I've learned so much from my friends who practice different traditions. Very dear friend of mine, Sahar, not in the room today, but we've gone to the mosque together. She's come to my Buddhist meeting with me. I have so much respect for people like that who are willing to, you know, who have that humility and who teach me that humility. So I think really that example is a very powerful one. And when people see us like that in community, they perhaps something will click and change. So yeah.
I think that idea of sort of speaking with people that don't have the same worldview of you is obviously even more pertinent in a world of social media algorithms where we are only exposed to our own worldview and people that share the same values as us. I'm going to take a couple of questions and then we'll go to the panel. So we'll take maybe 2 or 3 because I can see more hands up now. So yes, there was one at the back. And then panelists, we'll take a few at a time and then we'll come up forward.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for all of your contributions. Something I spotted in the language of some of the panelists was a commitment to tradition. So, for example, Giles mentioned, I don't want to project, not to paraphrase you, to turn it to some kind of religious Esperanto, I think is the phrase, or Zayn mentioned, we're not talking about similarity, but resonance. So it's kind of like a very deep respect for the boundaries. I wanted to challenge that a bit. And I wanted to ask you to reflect on your experiences of interfaith or this kind of work where boundaries are more blurred. Have you experienced that? And tradition is unfolding. I suspect Christianity or Buddhism or any tradition 2,000 years ago is not the same as what we're experiencing today, though we're talking of something continuous. Do you see any unfolding theologies, unfolding metaphysics? Is the project of metaphysics that we study the past, or is it something that is still unfolding?
Thank you very much. Was it got a question here? I think a microphone will just come to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I just got a message about this meeting through a friend, and I like the idea of somebody talking about sacred, and like in sacred nature. I'm kind of a foot pilgrimage for climate justice.
Okay.
I've been walking for the last 17 years. It means a lot to me that, in totally fractured, I feel from time to time that we are facing both a planetary and a civilizational crisis. And I thought, here is a bunch of guys who are now talking about something to bring us together. That's what. And then I got lost because I walked all the way from my home, which I tend to do within 5 to 7 kilometers, and I got lost because of construction and so on. So I went to the Sedgwick College. There, the porters asked him, I'm completely lost. Can you help me? We have nothing to do with them, but I will help you. That's what he said. Okay, that's a good thing. Divine intervention here, and that's how I came. So we are, we talk about. So I gather stories. I sing songs. I'm not a singer. I sing songs. So just people get attracted about it. And walking fast, people ask, why are you walking fast? Because time is running out. And so when I thought about how do we connect our faith or sacredness, then when I walked in the south of India, the Western Ghats, the mountains are older than Himalayas. And there's a river which is as sacred as Ganges. Mm-hmm. So then you start talking about the stories of a river across the various faiths. They have stories about why this water is so important. So for me, the sacred nature become a point of great conversation. And I totally agree that in most of our conversation, we don't talk about truth, search of truth. I like to think I'm a wannabe Sufi. So search of truth for me is very fundamental to everything. And in the process, we probably see beauty. And therefore, perhaps we can come to harmony. So those are the kind of things. So that's why I think what you have done for me is very important. And we need to take this story and then go back to people and say, this is what all these big minds, great minds, I'm a regular guy with irregular hair, I walk around and I sing songs. Yeah. But I want to kind of distill as much as I can from it and say, this is what they're saying. So what do you feel? We may be doing about 1,000 kilometers come November. I walked where the world leaders are meeting during COP meeting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to ask them that this is a book, I thought, wow, this is good. In this book, this is the story. And as a child, I was told about sacredness through stories only. Mm-hmm. A temple was sacred. A mountain was sacred because there were trees.
Yes.
There were good medicinal trees there. So we made things sacred like that. So I thought.
Thank you so much for sharing your reflections. I'm walking
that's
here
all I
and
wanted to say.
finding the place. I'm going to take one more and then we'll go to the panel because we need to leave. I think they're going to kick us out if we run over. So I did see, yes.
Right, and thank you, panel, for giving us such an enlightening talk. RFP UK.
Okay.
I wanted, when you give us the answers, to take on the question about the humanist, because the UK humanist comes out to claim that they are half, and people with faith is the other half. While people with faith very seldom say that we have a problem with you because you don't have a faith, they have a problem with us having a faith. Something very funny happened. I realized that they are starting to compile books where they go out to celebrate weddings, births, rites of passage in life. And they write it down. So I said, but that's a ceremony. And you are seeing a ceremony, then you are talking about a spiritual level. So when we say the sacred, do people who claim that they have no faith really have no sense of the sacred? I don't think so.
Right, that's a very good point.
I think they have that, but because they have this thing about religions, and you can see Richard Dawkins going 16 colors, going, vehemently denying that they are missing something for denying maybe what they call organized religion, that they are cutting off that bit of spirituality that they need to deny it in some ways. Now, when we go out to invite stories from them too, is there a bridge that we need to build for people to come back and forth? It's not a definite. You don't have to be black or white. You find yourself and you find that spirituality, and it changes throughout your life. So help us find that communication in between the religious and the people who claim that they have no religion. Or go to faith, go to conviction, go to whichever word they find happier to use. But tap into that spirituality anyway. So I would appreciate comments. Thank you.
So I'll ask you to be brief in answers, and just to remind us, so we had a question, actually the theme is kind of in a sense about building bridges. We had a question around, or boundaries, a question around, boundaries being blurred in terms of traditions and an unfolding theology, so that, develop over time. We had reflections around nature and the climate crisis, and there's a connection to that, and around building bridges with humanists and their worldview and their understanding of the sacred. So feel free to address part of that or all of it. Who'd like to give some final reflections?
I'll give one. Before coming into this room, I had the joy to speak with you and in the company of your husband, who's right here. And I watched the radiance of his smile as he was gazing at you. You've just finished your doctorate. And so I'm going to use a term that's often used between two people, and it's called mutual self-mediation. You do something very nice for your husband. Could be any social configuration we're talking about. And at least on a good day, that elicits from him a response of loving generosity back to you. And so a virtuous cycle is unfolding. And it's unfolding in the sense that he is helping you to make yourself by evoking from you gratitude and loving kindness in response to his gratitude and loving kindness. So among people, various configurations, and of course it can go the other way. Mutual self-mediation could be you do something nasty and the other person does something nasty back. But the point is, there's an interactivity of our making, our collective making of each other. Now today, the communities of historical faiths live everywhere. And the problems that the human family faces cut across all communities. And so I'm going to expand the notion of art. I love the conversation on art. I'm going to expand it to performative art. So what's happening, that dynamic of mutual self-mediation, is taking place today, and I'm answering you actually, taking place today among and between the religious communities. The religious communities are gathered. They're gathered around a real serious challenge of some kind. And an act of compassion or generosity is offered by one of those communities. Well, the other communities are not static and not inert, and they immediately are stimulated by that to re-look at what they have, much of it sort of half forgotten as relevant, and they bring it forward. And so the generosity of this community has evoked, just like the two of you, has evoked an organic, rooted generosity of a particular kind related to a particular challenge of the other communities involved. And I've personally seen virtuous cycles emerge across the traditions because they're jointly dealing with each other as radically concerned about very serious issues to help one another. What they're really doing is...
I'm going to have to jump
Sorry,
in because
sorry,
we are,
okay. I'm sorry, but you get the point.
Absolutely.
Thank
I just
you.
wanted to throw to
Thank you
final
very
thoughts,
much.
Sorry,
You're marvelous.
to
Thank
any
you.
other panelists who want to answer some of the questions that came.
Thank you very much.
Giles, did you have any?
Well, I mean, maybe sort of responding to that actually, and to some of the other questions. We were just doing a session of scriptural reasoning earlier, so thinking about this as a particular way of doing interreligious dialogue through looking at these very small, short passages from one another's scriptures together. My doctoral supervisor, David Ford, had a rather nice way of characterising what it is that scriptural reasoning does for everyone, in a sense, which is to take you deeper into your own tradition, deeper into the traditions of those with whom you're in dialogue, and deeper together into the world and the problems of the world, and that as an occasion for making this necessary, actually, rather than merely sort of agreeable or interesting. And I think that is something that is bringing, in a sense, the depths of traditions continually into dialogue with one another and with the problems of the world that is itself doing something new, as it were. It's not simply a kind of repetition of something ancient, but it is a kind of negotiation of that, aimed very particularly at improving the world, at something like human flourishing from within those traditions.
Thank you so much. I realise we couldn't do all the questions justice, but unfortunately we are going to get kicked out, so we're going to have to wrap it up there. But thank you all for coming, and thanks to our panellists.
Thank you.
Jumping up with a really practical message. If something you've heard has encouraged you to pick up a book, we have the books upstairs. Because we've run so tight on time, we don't have time to administer payments, but I will send everyone that registered an email to let you know how you could contribute back. Rather than them being, we're not selling the book so much as we're encouraging you to give something of the value of the book, and that money will come to the Cambridge Interfaith Programme to help us to continue to host events of this kind. So if you would like to take a book, I would encourage you to do so as you go upstairs before you depart. Thank you.
Brilliant job, and thank you so much for